The Pacific has swallowed countless secrets, but none as impossible as this one. In 1945, the most decorated American warship vanished without a single SOS. No wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. For decades, the Navy sealed the files, until the ocean finally spoke. And what it returned was a truth darker and louder than the war itself. The ocean lay still beneath a red dawn, its surface so perfectly smooth that it seemed suspended outside of time. Yet inside that deceptive quiet, something unseen drifted toward the USS Enterprise, a presence that neither the horizon nor the instruments could fully reveal. The famed Lucky E, a symbol of American endurance and the survivor of countless Pacific battles, was moving into a chapter of history no one on board was prepared to confront. By early 1945, confidence had settled deeply into the American fleet. Victories across the Pacific made triumph feel almost routine, and yet that sense of inevitability carried its own danger. Japan, cornered and desperate, had begun to twist strategy into something unpredictable, a pattern of last-ditch innovations meant to inflict maximum damage before the war's final turning point. Frontline crews felt that tension rising beneath every calm sunrise, a strange mix of optimism and unease that clung to the decks like sea mist. Captain Harold Beckett stood on the Enterprise's bridge with his usual composed posture. Years of command had carved lines of quiet resolve into his features, but underneath that steady exterior lived a catalog of memories few men could shoulder. He had seen ships vanish in minutes, storms rip apart formations, and brilliant young pilots disappear into clouds that never returned them. The Lucky E's reputation for survival had followed Beckett from port to port, whispered with awe and superstition, but he refused to let myth guide decision-making. The ocean respected vigilance, and Beckett knew better than to mistake routine for safety. Below deck, the steady hum of machinery filled the radar room, where Lieutenant Frank Delaney monitored the early watch. He had grown familiar with the aircraft-like pulse of the radar, the way each sweep moved like a heartbeat across the screen. But that morning carried an off-kilter rhythm, faint flickers that wavered at the edge of detection, too irregular for weather interference, and too deliberate to ignore. Radar reports from other vessels in Task Force 58 had noted similar anomalies in recent days, erratic signals blooming and vanishing before analysts could lock onto them. Most were dismissed as atmospheric interference, the Pacific's notorious distortion of long-range detection. Still, Delaney sensed something more intentional, lurking beyond the ordinary patterns. A low static tickled through the comms, soft but persistent, as if the sky itself were whispering unreadable information. Weather logs suggested a series of unstable temperature layers ahead, invisible ridges in the air capable of bending radar beams in unpredictable arcs. To the untrained eye, these irregularities meant little, but to Delaney, who had spent months learning the difference between noise and movement, they formed a subtle chain. It was the kind of barely perceptible shift that rarely meant danger on its own, yet never truly arrived without reason. The flight deck echoed with the muffled steps of early morning patrol crews moving through their checks. Each man carried that sharpened awareness familiar to sailors who had survived long campaigns, the instinctive tightening in the gut when calm seas feel too calm. The Pacific had a way of disguising trouble beneath a thin veil of serenity, holding the memory of past battles just beneath its surface. On mornings like this, it almost seemed to breathe differently. Across Task Force 58, the formation maintained its rigid geometry. Destroyers cut steady paths along the perimeter, cruisers scanned the sky with mechanical precision, and the carriers, the core of American power, advanced like an armored wall of steel and determination. Everything appeared normal, yet quiet reports from neighboring ships confirmed similar radar inconsistencies, patterns that appeared and disappeared with no clear origin, readings that couldn't be verified or replicated, uncertainty that no one could fully trace. Captain Beckett read through the morning briefings with the passive tension of a man accustomed to hidden variables. The Enterprise had endured torpedo strikes, bomb hits, near misses, and storms that would have broken lesser vessels. Experience taught Beckett that war rarely announced itself clearly. Trouble often approached subtly, disguised inside ordinary moments. And this morning felt too ordinary, too rehearsed, too still. He ordered updated radar sweeps, not out of alarm, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had kept the ship alive through countless operations. He trusted that impulse more than any superstition about luck. Back in the radar room, Delaney adjusted a series of frequency filters in an attempt to stabilize the faint signals. The screen flickered, cleared, then displayed a thin streak of motion that skated across the peripheral range. He frowned, recalibrated, and leaned in closer as the subtle anomaly pulsed again, this time with a more defined pattern. It moved, not with the randomness of weather interference, not with the drifting haze of cloud distortion, but with intention, a faint rhythm, a path, a formation. The calm static deepened, and the atmosphere inside the room tightened. Delaney felt a cold line creep down his spine as he increased the gain. The signals steadied, then multiplied, small shapes emerging like distant shadows sliding into view. He held his breath as the screen brightened, the shapes aligning into a faint but unmistakable pattern. Then the radar surged. 47 distinct blips burst across the display in a sudden, coordinated spread appearing as if from nowhere, moving with a speed and unity that froze every thought in Delaney's mind. And in the next instant, the entire screen dissolved into static. They called themselves the 47 not in celebration, not in pride, but in acknowledgement of a truth they carried alone. Each of them understood, without ceremony or command, that their flight would not end with a return to the Earth they knew. They were men bound by a duty shaped in the final tightening hours of a dying empire and on a remote Japanese airfield. That destiny waited like a shadow stretching across the morning light. Far from the American task force, the island lay quiet under a blanket of pale mist, its runways etched into volcanic rock that still held the night's lingering heat. The isolation of the place carried its own weight, a reminder that Japan's sprawling network of bases had shrunk into ragged pockets of resistance as the war turned irreversibly against them. Supply lines had collapsed, fuel reserves were thin, and the empire's reach had shriveled to desperate corners that clung to purpose even when victory no longer seemed possible. Yet, within that shrinking world, a single directive had arrived with unwavering clarity. The USS Enterprise must be stopped, no matter the cost. Commander Saito Arata stood at the edge of the flight line as mechanics moved in, practiced silence around the modified Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. He carried himself with measured composure, a man shaped by the traditions of service, not mythology. Tall, spare, and deliberate in movement, Saito had once believed in the Empire's sweeping ambitions. But years of attrition had pared down that belief into something more somber, something stripped of grandeur. What remained was duty, not to victory, but to those who still looked to him for direction. The pilots under his command moved with the same quiet resolve. Their expressions were calm, almost serene, as they checked their gear, adjusted harness straps, and prepared to step into the narrow cockpits that would soon become both battlefield and coffin. None of them spoke of fear, for fear was unnecessary. Their silence revealed everything. They had seen the Empire bend, fracture, and bleed. They knew their mission was not to protect territory or reclaim skies long lost. Their purpose was narrower, sharper, more symbolic. To strike the American carrier that had escaped destruction time after time the ship whispered about even among Japanese crews as impossible to sink. Honor and futility had never stood so close together. The aircraft themselves bore the marks of rushed modification. Extra fuel tanks had been removed to reduce weight, structural reinforcements were stripped down to essentials, and certain control systems had been altered to allow for tighter, faster dives. These were not standard Zeros. They were engineered for a single use, an airframe designed to deliver its pilot with precision rather than return him home. Even the engines carried a different tone when ignited, a coarse roar that vibrated through metal ribs as if aware of the destiny sealed within. Their casings. The airfield swelled with movement as pre-flight procedures unfolded. Mechanics wiped oil-streaked hands against uniforms creased from long nights of labor. Officers reviewed maps pinned beneath sandbags to keep the wind from catching their edges. The sky, thick with the gray-blue haze of early dawn, churned faintly with exhaust drifting upward in slow ribbons. The mood was cinematic in its stillness, an entire landscape holding its breath before the engines fully awakened. Commander Saito studied the flight route one final time. The path cut straight across the open Pacific, plotted with precision toward the last confirmed location of the Enterprise. Intelligence reports suggested that Task Force 58 would be pushing westward, scanning for remaining Japanese strongholds. For Saito, the route felt less like a strategy and more like an obligation written into the airspace itself. He understood that the Empire believed this mission would restore a sense of purpose. Perhaps it would, but standing there, listening to the deepening rumble of engines igniting in sequence, he sensed the larger truth. Purpose was not the same as survival. He moved along the line of aircraft, pausing beside each pilot. Their eyes met his with steady acceptance, not of glory, but of inevitability. Many were barely past youth, men who had once studied engineering, literature, navigation, or agriculture before the war consumed their paths. Now they carried the weight of a nation's final breath on their shoulders. Saito felt the gravity of that burden settle in his chest. These were not villains crafted for an enemy's narrative, nor zealots blind to consequence. They were soldiers shaped by circumstance, following a command issued in a world where options had evaporated. The engines rose to full power, sending vibrations across the tarmac. Dust lifted in swirling patterns around the wheels, and the thin island vegetation trembled beneath the force. The atmosphere thickened with the sensation of impending movement, as if the entire horizon leaned forward in anticipation. Saito climbed into his own cockpit, the narrow space closing around him, with the familiar scent of oil, metal, and worn leather. The canopy lowered, sealing him inside a world reduced to instruments, gauges, and sky. One by one, the Zero fighters rolled onto the runway, their silhouettes cutting dark shapes against the pale morning. The squadron accelerated in disciplined succession, wheels lifting from the ground with a precision that spoke of training honed long before desperation dictated their mission. They rose into formation with fluid ease, climbing through the layers of humid Pacific air until the landscape below became a blur of gray-green dots fading beneath their ascent. As they leveled into their assigned formation, a wall of low clouds swept across their path, dense and shifting like a storm forging itself in midair. Saito steadied his aircraft, feeling the subtle tremor of turbulence brushing the wings. The squadron pressed forward, disappearing into the rolling mass that concealed the Pacific beyond. The world narrowed to mist and engine noise. And at precisely 6:43 hours, every radar system across the Pacific went blind as the 47 vanished into the storm. The first explosion wasn't seen, it was felt. A deep, resonant tremor that seemed to rise from the ocean floor and shudder through the steel bones of the USS Enterprise. It came not as a flash or a plume of smoke, but as a single jolt that stopped conversations mid-sentence and turned every head toward the horizon. For a heartbeat, the ship held still, as if the Pacific itself had paused, and then the sky answered. Moments earlier, the crew had lived inside a tense uncertainty. Radar systems across the task force remained unstable, flickering with static that left operators half-blind to whatever pressed toward them. Captain Harold Beckett stood on the bridge scanning an empty expanse of sea, while his instincts whispered warnings his instruments couldn't confirm. Frank Delaney had returned to his station, recalibrating again and again, searching for the faint signals that had vanished too abruptly to be natural. Conversations on deck were brief and clipped, filled with the timplins, unspoken knowledge that whatever had caused the earlier radar disruption was still out there, drawing closer by the minute. Then the static cracked open with a burst of noise, and Delaney saw it, a sudden bloom of contacts, punching through the distortion. 47 signatures, aligned in formation, moving fast. His shout hit the intercom at the same moment the alarm bells wailed across the ship. Beckett didn't need more than a glance at the updated display. His command voice cut through the bridge like a blade. Orders scattered across the decks with practiced urgency, as the Enterprise shifted from uneasy calm to battle readiness in seconds. Anti-aircraft batteries roared awake, crews sprinting into position with the fluid coordination of men who had long rehearsed the steps of survival. Pilots raced toward their aircraft as flight officers relayed emergency launch instructions, each man knowing that seconds mattered more than strategy. The deck vibrated with the thunder of engines warming and the air thickened with the familiar smell of aviation fuel mixing with the morning wind. Voices crackled over radios, layered with tension, hope, and the rigid discipline that had defined years of Pacific combat. The first distant shapes appeared as faint shadows to the east, sliding out of the cloud bank like ghosts drawn from vapor. They flew low, fast, and tight, a formation too small to be a standard strike group, too unified to be anything accidental. The moment Beckett confirmed their angle of approach, he understood the intent behind their silence. These were not scouts or escorts. They were weapons guided by human hands. The ship shuddered again as the anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Flak bursts erupted across the sky in dark, pulsing clouds, each one expanding like ink blooms against the pale morning. Tracer rounds streaked upward in orange arcs, stitching patterns of defense that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. Fighter pilots lifted off the Tanaquil deck, climbing through the haze of smoke and exhaust, just as the first wave of incoming aircraft broke formation and dove. From above, the battle looked like a storm swallowing itself. From below, it felt like chaos stretching across every sense. The roar of engines merged with the rapid percussion of AA fire. Smoke curled through open corridors. The heat of burning oil spread across sections of the deck, turning metal into shimmering, distorted reflections. Sailors moved through it all with a blend of urgency and controlled fear, each man focused on a task shaped by reflex rather than thought. Beckett remained on the bridge as long as conditions allowed, watching the sky fracture into movement. He tracked individual aircraft diving between flak bursts, each one descending with purpose, each one forcing the ship's defenses to respond faster, harder, with less certainty. His officers relayed damage reports and ammunition counts, their voices steady despite the pressure building around them. The Enterprise had survived so much: torpedoes, bombs, storms, fire. But the force of this attack carried an energy unlike the battles that had come before. Delaney, below deck, called out new bearings as more contacts punched through the chaos. Sweat gathered on his collar as the radar flickered between clarity and static. The signals shifting so rapidly, he felt as though he were deciphering a language the sky hadn't spoken before. The calculations blurred, not from panic but from sheer speed, as he attempted to guide the ship's defenses with data that changed faster than men could react. Above him, the first direct impact struck. The deck shook with a force that rolled through the corridors like a wave of dull pressure. The carrier's superstructure trembled. Cables quivered overhead. Another strike followed, then another, each one sending plumes of smoke curling skyward. The control tower absorbed the worst of the hits, metal buckling under the assault as flames climbed its walls. Sections of its frame folded inward, collapsing with a noise that seemed too large for the space it occupied. The Enterprise, long defined by its resilience, now carried the weight of burning history. For years, it had outrun destruction, its near misses becoming part of its legend. Sailors believed the ship possessed something beyond engineering, a spirit, a streak of survival that defied logic. But now that legend flickered beneath the reality of smoke, fire, and a sky tearing itself apart. Despite the violence erupting around them, the tragedy did not lie in the destruction alone. It lived in the human faces behind each aircraft diving toward the ship faces. Beckett glimpsed for brief seconds through the haze, faces shaped by resolve rather than hatred. Each pilot had committed to a flight with only one possible ending, and in those final seconds, the space between attacker and defender seemed painfully thin, defined not by ideology, but by the shared fate of men caught in the machinery of war. Flames surged across the deck, fed by ruptured fuel lines and wind-driven heat. Smoke darkened the sky until the horizon blurred into a single gray mass. Communications officers fought to keep channels clear, voices cutting through the static with urgency that strained every syllable. The ship's hull groaned under the shifting weight, and power lines flickered as circuits overloaded. Through the crackling chaos, one final transmission struggled to break free from the failing systems. "This is CV6. We're going under." Then the signal dissolved into silence. 3 days later, the ocean was empty. Not silent. The Pacific was never truly silent, but empty in a way that unsettled even the most seasoned reconnaissance crews. The search planes circled for hours over coordinates where the USS Enterprise was last reported, scanning a surface washed clean by tide and time. There were no bodies, no lifeboats, no floating remnants of a shattered carrier. Only thin streaks of oil drifting across the waves, spreading like faded fingerprints over a place that should have held answers. The U.S. Navy had launched the largest search effort attempted since the early Pacific battles. Destroyers carved methodical paths across the water, their lookouts posted at every vantage point. Aircraft traced grid patterns with unwavering precision, dipping low enough for the roar of engines to ripple through the ocean's skin. Each return to base brought back the same report: oil slicks, faint debris, and nothing that could explain how a 500-foot carrier could vanish almost without a trace. Commander Robert Hayes arrived on the scene with a gravity shaped by years of investigative duty. He carried the reputation of a man able to dismantle chaos into patterns, someone who understood the difference between destruction and disappearance. Tall, deliberate in movement, and unflinching in manner, Hayes stood on the deck of the USS Renshaw and watched the horizon with a restrained unease. The official orders used the neutral term incident, but every officer present knew the truth. Carriers did not simply go missing. Not the Enterprise, not the Lucky E. Procedures unfolded with the efficiency expected of the Pacific Fleet. Hayes supervised the expansion of the search grid, outlining new sectors over map tables crowded with compasses, pencils, and layers of transparent overlays. Sonar operators swept the depths for metallic echoes, listening for even the faintest signature of a hull resting on the sea floor. Messages crackled through radio channels with clipped urgency, carrying status updates from ships scattered across the search pattern. The surrounding waters, however, responded with stubborn quiet, as if they had folded the entire event into their depths. From Pearl Harbor to San Diego, families waited for word, reading the sparse headlines that appeared in newspapers across the country. Carrier missing. One paper declared, its stark phrasing leaving readers suspended between hope and dread. The Enterprise had been an icon, a home to thousands of sailors, and a beacon of endurance through years of brutal combat. News of its disappearance radiated outward, reaching households that had followed its victories from the Coral Sea to the Philippine Sea. For many, the Lucky E was more than steel. It was reassurance that survival was possible. Now that reassurance had vanished. Hayes reviewed intercepted fragments of radio transmissions from the morning of the attack. Most were drowned in static, shredded by the interference that had plagued the task force that day. But a few pieces held structure. A distress signal that cut off without coordinates. A garbled report referencing a sudden loss of visual. And one fragment Hayes replayed 3 times before accepting its authenticity. The strained voice of an officer stating that the ship was losing deck integrity. None of the fragments revealed why the radar systems across the Pacific went blind just minutes before the attack reached its peak. As the search expanded outward, mystery deepened instead of clearing. The official archives recorded the Enterprise as missing in action, but the documentation was sparse, almost unfinished, as if the event resisted being captured on paper. Surviving ships in Task Force 58 filed reports that contradicted one another on timings, headings, and visibility. Some sailors insisted they saw the Enterprise engulfed in fire before losing contact. Others believed they had glimpsed the story, carrier turning sharply away, disappearing into smoke that swallowed the horizon. In the fog of battle, memory reshaped itself into fragments Hayes struggled to align. Then came the stranger accounts, informal, unverified, yet persistent. Crews from distant vessels reported hearing faint Morse code signals at night, tapping patterns that repeated at irregular intervals. Sonar operators claimed they detected rhythmic pulses beneath the waves, too structured to be whales, too faint to be machinery. A few older sailors whispered that the ocean sometimes returned the voices of ships lost without explanation. Hayes did not entertain superstition, but he logged every report, even the unlikely held value in a case where nothing made sense. The list of theories grew long enough to fill an entire brief. Sabotage was considered, then dismissed. Enemy ambush was plausible but insufficient to explain the total disappearance. Atmospheric anomalies, magnetic interference, and weather-induced radar distortion were all weighed, studied, and set aside. A cover-up was whispered among junior officers, but offered no answers, only more questions. Every path Hayes examined ended in the same place. The Enterprise had vanished with a finality that defied known patterns of naval loss. On the 7th day of the search, a buoy was recovered 50 miles off the original grid. It was battered, scarred by heat, and partially submerged. The technicians who retrieved it noted remnants of scorch marks along its metal surface and fragments of burnt wiring clinging to its interior. Whatever had damaged, it carried immense force. Hayes ordered it brought aboard the Renshaw for immediate analysis. The buoy held a single recorded message, a partially corrupted burst of encrypted signal that took the communications team hours to stabilize. Static filled most of the file, but enough structure remained for the analysts to attempt decoding. Hayes waited in a dim compartment as the last. Fragments were translated into a coherent line of text. It contained no coordinates, no technical warnings, no final statement from the bridge. Only one haunting message had survived. The 47 are with us. Decades later, long after the headlines faded and the search grids dissolved into history, the ocean finally gave back its secret. It happened without ceremony, without warning, and without the dramatic flourish often imagined in stories about lost ships. Instead, it began with a flicker on a modern sonar screen aboard a research vessel charting the deeper edges of a Pacific trench, a flicker unlike any formation the team had recorded before. It was subtle, almost shy, yet unmistakably shaped by human hands, long claimed by the sea. The research crew had not been searching for the Enterprise. Their mission focused on geological shifts along the trench walls, studying plate movements and thermal vents. Yet as the submersible descended through the layers of muted blue, the operator noticed an outline emerging in the murk, larger than any debris field they had encountered in previous dives. The closer the submersible sank, the more defined the structure became, a vast skeletal hull, resting at an angle, its once proud form twisted by pressure and time. The floodlights swept across towering metal frames, beams bent inward, and remnants of a flight deck scorched into a mosaic of rust and shadow. There was no mistaking it. The wreckage belonged to USS Enterprise CV-6. The announcement carried through the research vessel with a weight that quieted even the youngest crew members. The Lucky E, missing for more than 70 years, had been found in a silence so profound it felt reverential. The submersible's cameras drifted through the shattered remains of catwalks, burned-out turrets, and the tangled metal that had once supported aircraft launches that shaped the course of the Pacific War. The ocean had transformed the ship into a cathedral of steel and memory, preserving it with a tenderness that defied its destructive reputation. Inside the fractured hangar deck, the submersible pilot noticed a cluster of corroded containers pressed against a collapsed bulkhead. Most were crushed or breached, but one remained sealed, its metal casing encased in a protective coat of mineral buildup. It seemed out of place, surviving intact when so much around it had surrendered to the pressure. A robotic arm carefully lifted it, securing it for retrieval, and as the container surfaced aboard the vessel, the crew gathered in a circle around it, knowing they were witnessing a moment no archive had ever recorded. When the container was opened, the interior revealed a watertight compartment, its lining worn but functional. Inside lay a logbook, its corners frayed, its leather cracked, yet its pages remarkably preserved. It took hours before the researchers dared turn the first page. Written in tight, steady script was the name of the man who had recorded it: Lieutenant Frank Delaney, the radar officer whose final sightings had triggered the Enterprise's last battle. The logbook unfolded a chronology that historians had never been able to reconstruct. Delaney wrote, not as a dramatist, but as a man documenting events in real time, capturing each moment with the clarity of someone who understood that words might be the only survivors. He detailed the onset of radar failure, the sudden reappearance of the 47, and the rapid shift from confusion to certainty as the ship's defenses sprang into motion. He described the overwhelming noise, the suffocating heat, and the way smoke swallowed distances until the sky became indistinguishable from the deck. His account reflected not fear alone, but a profound acceptance of the fate overtaking all of them. Through his entries, the final minutes of the Enterprise emerged with devastating vividness. Delaney wrote of crew members holding their positions even as visibility vanished. He recorded the disintegration of the control tower, the collapse of communications, and the sharp, final tremor that rippled through the ship before systems went dark. But he also included something no report had captured: the strange flicker of shapes through the smoke, the silhouettes of the 47 diving with unwavering precision. He did not describe them as enemies in those final moments, but as fellow travelers caught in the same spiral toward oblivion. The logbook revealed a truth submerged with the ship. The 47 fighters had not escaped the battle. Their aircraft had crashed into the sea around the Enterprise, their wreckage settling into the trench beside the carrier. The sea had drawn both sides into a shared grave, erasing the sharp lines of conflict that had defined their final hours. Delaney's last written line reflected that recognition, a simple acknowledgement that the battle's end had left no victors, only men bound together by the ocean's unyielding pull. For the researchers, the discovery carried an emotional gravity that lingered beyond scientific interest. The Enterprise, long mythologized for its survival, had not been defeated by a single force, but rather consumed by the collective weight of history, sacrifice, and time. The Pacific had preserved its story not out of disregard, but out of a kind of solemn respect. The ship had become part of the trench, part of the quiet memory the ocean holds for those who vanish beneath it. As the submersible completed its final pass over the wreck, drifting above the contorted steel and the silent wings of aircraft fused to the seafloor, the sonar registered a faint signal, a single, brief Morse code pulse, tapped through the headphones, too soft to be interference, too structured to be dismissed. The crew froze as the pattern resolved into 3 simple letters, repeated only once. Still here. Before you leave this story behind, remember, history survives only when those who hear it choose to carry it forward. If this forgotten chapter of the Pacific moved you, let your voice join the countless echoes still drifting across those waters. Your support helps uncover the stories time tried to erase and the ocean tried to keep. Stay with us. There are more secrets waiting beneath the waves. But tell me this. If you heard that final Morse code pulse in the dark, what do you think it meant? A memory, a message, or something still calling from the deep?